Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the extravagant, ridiculous, and at times questionably hygienic bedrooms of medieval monarchs, places where ambition, desire, and a complete lack of personal space collided spectacularly. Before we get cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these history dives. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's tuning in from around the world. Now, lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soothing hum, and let's drift into tonight's tale together. King John of England, also called John Lackland, or informally Britain's worst dinner companion, is remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow still finding time to behave inappropriately with nearly every noblewoman in sight. His reign, from 1199 to 1216, became a masterclass in political disaster and personal chaos. John didn't merely pursue affairs, he commandeered them. He was infamous for abducting noble ladies, holding them in royal fortresses, and entertaining them until they were either married off or quietly forgotten. His favorite tactic for breaking apart powerful households wasn't war. It was seducing the wife, angering the husband, and then taxing him twice over. Efficient, if appalling. Chroniclers were so disturbed that even biased medieval writers, people who ignored witch trials, described him as immoderate with women and unrestrained with wives and daughters. That's medieval code for he made every holiday feast deeply uncomfortable. At one point, John supposedly had 30 mistresses on official record. That's not romantic. That's human resources mismanagement. Several nobles complained directly to the crown, a polite way of saying he seduced everyone, including servants and maybe the family livestock. His conduct was so notorious it nearly sparked rebellion, not over taxes or war, but because half the barons refused to leave their wives alone in his presence. One noble even declined a royal audience unless his household was locked away first. Diplomacy, 13th century style. Yet John never saw an issue. He thought himself irresistible. The only evidence for that comes from his own letters. But when you're king, delusion is part of the job description. By the end, John left behind a broken realm, a legacy of distrust, and probably a few unacknowledged heirs no one mentioned at court. He was the sort of ruler who made people invent democracy just to keep him from visiting. Maybe not history's worst monarch, but definitely one you wouldn't trust to babysit. Charles VI of France, better known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422, and yes, that nickname was earned, not handed out at a party. He began his reign with potential, young, charming, capable. Then came the decline. He forgot his own name, attacked his knights, and once believed he was made of glass, insisting on being wrapped in blankets to prevent shattering. Not exactly the image of royal strength, but certainly a creative form of paranoia. Most rulers who think they're fragile figurines tend to avoid scandal. Not Charles. He somehow managed to maintain a mistress, a delusion, and a civil war all at once, impressive multitasking. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to keep the court functional while Charles ran screaming from mirrors and refused to bathe, fearing water would dissolve him. Meanwhile, his mistress, Odette de Chamdivers, quietly moved into the palace, publicly called his comfort, medieval code for don't ask questions. Odette remained with him through his most unstable years, either saintly or legally strategic. She brushed his hair, endured his glass talk, and helped him into padded layers so he could sit safely. Nothing says devotion like strapping your lover into a pillow suit. Charles's eccentricities didn't stop in private. At one infamous masquerade, the Bal d'Ardents, he and his companions dressed as wild men in flammable costumes and danced by torchlight. Naturally, someone dropped a flame. Several courtiers burned alive. Charles survived, but his dignity didn't. Despite it all, he fathered 12 children, several conceived during brief intervals of lucidity. Chroniclers don't confirm whether he remembered their names, but one imagines. Glass Jr. wasn't on the list. Charles VI led France toward ruin, yet somehow turned mental illness, scandal, and pyrotechnic disasters into one tragicomic royal saga, and still kept his crown. Then came Peter of Castile, known either as Peter the Cruel or Peter the Just, depending on whether you were at his side or under his floorboards. He ruled from 1350 to 1369, combining royal charm, obsessive jealousy, and the occasional politically inconvenient homicide. His early love life was complicated. He fell for a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla, whom he may have married in secret, emphasis on may, since he was also forced into political marriages that made the situation crowded. One such bride was Blanche of Bourbon, whom he wed and then imprisoned 3 days later. She spent the rest of her life locked away because Peter decided Maria had nicer hair, or maybe because Blanche's accent annoyed him. Either way, it was a medieval masterclass in ghosting. Maria remained his lifelong obsession. Even after other marriages, she was his true favorite. When she died, Peter wept for days and then declared her his lawful wife retroactively, confusing everyone and perhaps justifying their 4 existing children. But Peter's passions didn't stop there. His version of love often ended violently. One mistress tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, along with a few cousins and unlucky courtiers who made too much eye contact. Contemporary sources say Peter sometimes watched executions while lounging with a lover, not romantic, just deeply unhinged. Still, the Castilian court was never dull. Gossip flowed faster than wine, and Peter's romances blurred the line between devotion and vengeance. His idea of romantic gestures included sudden weddings, abrupt divorces, and the occasional surprise stabbing. Eventually, his half-brother killed him, a fitting end for a man who treated family like political opponents. Peter remains remembered as one of Europe's most dangerously passionate rulers. If love is a battlefield, he brought siege engines. As for Edward II of England, reigning from 1307 to 1327, history remembers him for 2 things: losing to the Scots at Bannockburn and showing far more affection to his male favorites than to his queen. One of those things counted as treason. The other was just a terrible dinner topic. Our story begins with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion, rumored lover, and part-time fashion disaster. Piers wasn't merely close to Edward. He was showered with absurd favors, estates, jewels, and titles, none of which matched his wardrobe. At Edward's coronation, Piers sparkled brighter than the crown itself and even upstaged the queen, a bold choice when your safety depends on nobles not wanting you dead. Spoiler, they did. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was understandably outraged. She brought with her a rich dowry and major political expectations, none of which included sharing her throne with her husband's favorite. Edward, however, refused to let go. When the nobles demanded Piers' exile, Edward pouted, sent him away, and promptly called him back. It was like a teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the barons had enough and executed Piers. Edward was heartbroken, full mourning garb, tears, the entire medieval soap opera. Instead of learning anything, he simply replaced him with another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh made Piers look subtle. He wasn't just an advisor, he was practically a co-king. He claimed lands, titles, and entire counties while everyone else grew furious. Isabella, by then, shifted from irritated spouse to avenging fury. She found her own lover, naturally one of Edward's enemies, and together they invaded England, dethroned Edward, and imprisoned him. He was stripped of his crown and possibly killed in a manner involving a red-hot poker. The story's details are debated, but let's just say medieval revenge wasn't known for restraint. Edward II's reign was less about ruling and more about personal chaos. A royal reality show that would have been banned on medieval Netflix. His greatest mistake, mixing politics with passion and assuming power, made him untouchable. Turns out, it didn't. Wenceslas of Bohemia, ruling in the late 14th century, technically held the titles King of the Romans and King of Bohemia, though King of Bad Decisions might have fit better. If you're picturing the kind and noble, good King Wenceslas, from the carol, Wrong Relative. This one was neither good nor sober for long. Crowned young, intelligent, and multilingual, Wenceslas started strong but soon decided the royal wine merchant was more valuable than his ministers. He developed a talent for marathon drinking sessions that doubled as policy meetings. His courtiers brought flasks to survive discussions, not to celebrate them. Negotiations ended with tables flipped, duels initiated using breadsticks, and the occasional royal streaking incident. Chroniclers even described him giving speeches completely naked except for a sword belt. His reasoning: clothes are for cowards. Hard to argue when the unarmed party is facing a drunk king with no pants. Romantically, Wenceslas favored barmaids, laundresses, and sometimes noblewomen, though he seemed more interested in their ale preferences than their affections. Affairs weren't scandalous at his court. They were practically part of the hiring process. When a noble accused him of seducing his sister, Wenceslas reportedly shrugged and offered him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire grew tired of his antics and politely deposed him. "You're fired," but diplomatically. Even his own brother called him useless, half-dressed, and usually unconscious. Still, he somehow ruled Bohemia for decades. His people tolerated him like one tolerates a loud uncle at weddings, with sighs, careful seating, and strong liquor. In the end, he left behind a shaky realm, an overflowing wine cellar, and a reputation summarized as, "He ruled like every day was his last hangover." Then there was Henry VIII of England, proof of what happens when limitless power meets limitless desire. Ruling from 1509 to 1547, he spent most of it getting married, divorced, or furious at the Pope for disapproving of his love life. You've heard the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that's just the trailer. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, endured 2 decades of marriage before Henry decided God was punishing him for not producing a son. His solution wasn't reflection, it was annulment, excommunication, and the founding of an entirely new church. He created Anglicanism just to change partners. That's not piety. That's stubbornness with cathedral funding. Next came Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Henry showered her with love letters, full of passion, obsession, and unfortunate poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later outshine him as one of England's greatest rulers, but failed to provide a son. That, combined with court gossip, led to accusations of adultery, witchcraft, and impertinent side-eye. She was executed soon after, because in Tudor England, romance was a full-contact sport. Henry moved on with all the emotional depth of a turnip. Jane Seymour followed, producing a long-awaited son, Edward, before passing away from childbirth complications. Henry mourned her, sincerely but briefly, about 11 days, before browsing for wife number 4. Next came Anne of Cleves, chosen from a flattering portrait that turned out to be, shall we say, optimistic. In person, Henry complained she looked like a Flemish mare. Their marriage lasted 6 months, ending in something close to a peaceful annulment, and the Tudor version of a politely worded breakup note. Then came Catherine Howard, young, lively, and not nearly discreet enough. She was executed for adultery, though it's difficult to fault her. Being married to Henry at that point meant managing a gout-ridden, paranoid man who still imagined himself irresistible. Finally, Catherine Parr, educated, calm, and careful enough to survive him. By the time Henry died, he had drained the treasury, devoured livestock like appetizers, and transformed his court into a reality show where vows and heads rolled in equal measure. Henry VIII ruled with passion, dined with excess, and left behind more drama than most dynasties could handle. Across the Channel, Francis I of France reigned from 1515 to 1547, a Renaissance king in every sense, cultured, magnetic, and utterly incapable of remaining faithful. He brought Leonardo da Vinci to France, raised palaces like art projects, and turned France into Europe's cultural heartbeat. Yet while painters painted and poets swooned, Francis collected lovers the way others collected relics. His court shimmered with wealth and flirtation, something between a political salon and an extravagant dating service. The so-called ladies of the bedchamber were meant to assist the queen, though in Francis's world they often assisted the king instead. He once derailed entire alliances by seducing an ambassador's wife and bragged that French kings were expected to excel in romance, a claim he seemed eager to prove. His most famous companion, Françoise de Foix, was witty, well-read, and fearless enough to tease him in public. When replaced, as all royal favorites eventually were, and de Pisseleu de Hailly took her place, charming courtiers and outlasting rivals with sharp intelligence and sharper timing. Even his enemies noticed. Emperor Charles V called Francis more dangerous in bed than in battle. Francis likely accepted that as a compliment. Despite his endless flirtations, Francis ruled effectively, though expensively. His reign was all silk, scent, and scandal, a blur of diplomacy and desire. France gained art, architecture, and a reputation for romance, while its king gained everything else. Meanwhile, Alfonso XI of Castile ruled from 1311 to 1350, and his favorite pastime was publicly ignoring his wife. Queen Maria of Portugal was noble, respected, and politically ideal. Unfortunately for her, she wasn't Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alfonso truly adored. Leonor, sharp and ambitious, bore him 11 children and enough influence to run the court herself. She didn't need a crown, she had his devotion, and everyone knew it. Alfonso built her palaces, granted her estates, and paraded her at every royal gathering while Queen Maria sat quietly beside empty wine cups. Leonor wasn't a secret, she was the second monarch. She advised on treaties, wielded power, and filled the royal nursery with heirs while Maria became little more than an afterthought. Alfonso barely concealed his preference, spending a single, symbolic visit with his wife before retreating once again to Leonor's side. Maria's father, the King of Portugal, was predictably furious. Diplomatic relations soured until armies nearly marched over the scandal. It was less a love triangle and more an international crisis, the sort of royal drama that made even war look like a polite misunderstanding. Alonso didn't exactly lose sleep over scandal. He continued parading Leonor through court like a prize he'd won in a tournament, and likely would have kept doing it indefinitely, if the Black Death hadn't arrived to wrap things up for him in 1350. It quite literally took a plague to end his romance. After Alonso's death, Queen Maria finally had her moment. She ordered Leonor imprisoned and executed, a decision historians call vengeful, though most would agree it was simply overdue justice. For all his military achievements, Alonso's true legacy was being one of medieval Europe's most publicly besotted monarchs. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, though not for his temperament, ruled from 1285 to 1314. The nickname came from his face, not his heart. Outwardly devout and dignified, he governed France like a grim morality play, complete with secret trials, whispered betrayals, and a generous helping of hypocrisy. His greatest scandal, the Tour de Nesle affair, began when his daughter Isabella, yes, the one who later overthrew England's Edward II, noticed her sisters-in-law spending a little too much time with certain knights. Philip launched an investigation with the delicacy of a siege engine. 2 princesses were found guilty, shorn, imprisoned, and humiliated. The knights were tortured and executed, proof that moral reform often looks suspiciously like vengeance. Meanwhile, Philip was rumored to keep his own collection of mistresses, discreetly tucked inside the Louvre. Some whispered he even arranged entertainments for visiting dignitaries, purely for diplomacy, of course. But no one dared question him, because when you write the commandments, sin starts to look a lot like strategy. His crusade against the Knights Templar, officially for heresy, unofficially for their money, showed how piety could be weaponized for profit. Behind the chiseled jawline and solemn stare stood a man fluent in double standards and secret doors. Then came Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, a man who collected titles the way he collected wine goblets, enthusiastically and in bulk. Smart, charming, and multilingual, he also possessed a private life so exuberant it could have been set to lute music. Married to Queen Mary of Hungary mostly by formality, he preferred affairs that required less conversation and more discretion, or sometimes less of both. His romantic roster ranged from noblewomen to singers, his court so full of former lovers that historians suspect they started numbering them. One mistress even had her own chapel, which was either deeply symbolic or wildly inappropriate. Sigismund liked disguises, often sneaking into towns dressed as a merchant, a 6-foot royal commoner, with servants in embroidered crests. Somehow it worked. Between crusades and councils, he still found time to charm Europe's women and occasionally its diplomats. One ambassador noted that Sigismund treated all women as equals, especially, it seems, in private. Despite his escapades, he remained widely admired, a ruler, a reformer, and Europe's most unrepentant romantic. And finally, Louis XV of France, Louis the Beloved, who reigned from 1715 to 1774, though reigned might be generous. His true kingdom was Versailles, and his government ran largely on perfume and satin. Promising in youth, distracted in maturity, Louis turned policy into an afterthought and pleasure into a profession. Near Versailles stood the Parc aux Cerfs, a discreet mansion where young women were recruited, rotated, and rewarded with gifts and titles. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, managed the king and the country both, until Louis, ever the multitasker, simply built a second harem. The system was almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. When a mistress's term ended, she received housing, jewels, and silence. The queen, Marie Lesksinska, faded quietly into the background, respected but irrelevant. By mid-reign, Versailles had become less a royal court and more a well-dressed rumor mill. Foreign envoys gossiped about turnover rates as if they were trade reports. It wasn't governance, it was indulgence with better table manners. Louis ruled a kingdom of mirrors, where desire passed for diplomacy, and history learned that affection, in excess, can bankrupt empires just as easily as war. Ironically, Louis XV genuinely believed he was doing a decent job between masked balls, discreet pregnancies, and the kind of marital silences that could echo through Versailles. His reign wasn't a total disaster, but it set the stage for his unfortunate grandson, Louis XVI, the one who quite literally lost his head. Perhaps if grandfather Louis had spent less time with the wrong kind of crown, France might have fared better. In the end, he left behind a debt-ridden nation, a weary nobility, and a legacy summarized neatly as adored by women, despised by accountants. Then came Christian VII of Denmark, reigning from 1766 to 1808, or, more accurately, wobbling through his duties while others managed the details. The poor man suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and had only a passing interest in governance unless it involved chasing servants with cutlery, which he apparently found delightful. Christian's wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, expected a functional marriage. What she received instead was a husband who preferred talking to his hand, public self-amusement, and impromptu horseback pantomimes down palace corridors. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the royal physician, clever, ambitious, and alarmingly good at taking charge. Within months, he became both Denmark's de facto ruler and, inconveniently, the Queen's lover. Caroline, understandably lonely, leaned into the scandal. The king, blissfully unaware or simply uninterested, was content to be distracted by puppet shows and padded rooms. Struensee drafted laws, signed decrees, and revolutionized the government, while the monarch hummed to himself in the background. Caroline and Struensee even produced a child, officially royal, unofficially complicated. For a brief, shining moment, Denmark functioned as an Enlightenment-themed soap opera. Progressive reforms, forbidden romance, and an oblivious king at its center. But as always, royal gossip travels fast. Christian's mother-in-law orchestrated a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed with tragic flair. Caroline was exiled, her reputation shredded, and Christian returned to his quiet corner of supervised existence. His reign is remembered not for statecraft but for sheer absurdity. A king who ruled nothing, a queen who tried too hard, and a doctor who flew too close to the throne. Historians call it a constitutional crisis. Everyone else calls it Denmark's strangest love story. And across the channel, Charles II of England, reigning from 1660 to 1685, returned from exile with one clear goal: bring back joy, preferably in the company of as many mistresses as logistics would allow. Mission accomplished. After years of war and hiding in oak trees, Charles decided the nation deserved less piety and more pleasure. The merry monarch transformed his court into a glittering carnival of wit, wine, and questionable decisions. He had a legion of mistresses, official, unofficial, and occasionally both. His most famous was Nell Gwynn, the quick-witted actress who branded herself, the Protestant, to stand out from her Catholic competition. Then came Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, who wasn't so much a mistress as a royal roommate. Installed permanently in the palace, she bore him several children, each generously rewarded with titles and land. Nepotism, it seems, was never more charming. Charles ruled lightly, loved deeply, and left behind a kingdom slightly poorer but considerably more entertained. Charles II of England didn't even pretend to be discreet. He brought his mistresses to court functions, paid them royal stipends, and even built a private corridor at Whitehall so they could reach his chambers without interrupting diplomatic business. Efficiency, thy name was Charles. Queen Catherine of Braganza, his patient and perpetually sidelined wife, endured it all with grace and perhaps a discreet flask. She bore no children, prompting Charles to remark, "She could not give me heirs, but she never gave me trouble." A line that's equal parts compliment and warning label. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, most of whom he acknowledged and rewarded with titles, estates, and birthday parties grander than coronations. Meanwhile, the legitimate line stayed childless, as if fate enjoyed irony. Scandals aside, Charles was adored. He reopened theaters, restored the monarchy with charm, and wore more eyeliner than half his actresses. England forgave him everything, because for the first time in years, kingship looked fun. On his deathbed, his last words weren't about God or duty but, "Let not poor Nellie starve." A monarch to the end, just not the responsible kind. Then came Eric XIV of Sweden, who reigned from 1560 to 1568, a brief rule filled with paranoia, poetry, and catastrophic romance. At first, Eric seemed the ideal Renaissance king, tall, learned, fond of astronomy and the arts. But he consulted astrologers more than advisors, and the stars, unhelpfully, never told him to calm down. He courted Queen Elizabeth I of England with relentless optimism, sending portraits like celestial spam. When she ignored him entirely, he moved on to Karen Mansdaughter, the daughter of a jailer. The nobility was scandalized. Eric, defiant, married her anyway, and promptly began unraveling. He grew erratic, imprisoning nobles and suspecting betrayal in every polite glance. The breaking point came at a dinner, now known as the Stour murders, when Eric personally stabbed a guest mid-meal while muttering about cosmic conspiracies. By then, he was hearing voices and disguising himself to spy on his own council. His brother eventually staged a coup, a royal intervention with chains. Eric spent his remaining years imprisoned, writing unsettling love poems to Karen and ranting about treachery in the moonlight. Sweden learned several lessons. Don't mix astrology with governance, don't host dinner with armed kings, and never trust a monarch who swears the constellations are gossiping about him. And then there was Ferdinand I of Naples, Ferdinand of Aragon, a ruler equal parts efficient administrator and Gothic horror enthusiast. Charismatic, cunning, and deeply unsettling, Ferdinand restored stability to his realm while maintaining a hobby that would send most guests fleeing before dessert. Instead of merely executing traitors, he preserved them, literally. After disposing of rebellious nobles, he had their bodies embalmed and arranged in an underground gallery beneath his castle, known ominously as the Black Room. He'd personally lead guests through the collection, identifying each figure by name and crime. Some were mid-scream, others politely labeled. One ambassador fainted. Ferdinand laughed. If TripAdvisor had existed, the reviews would read, 5 stars, educational and emotionally scarring. When not curating his macabre museum, Ferdinand devoted himself to less grisly but equally prolific pursuits. He fathered countless illegitimate children, granting them lands and titles as if distributing party favors. His official queen was one among many. His mistresses ranged from nobility to farmers' daughters. Banquets often blurred into flirting competitions, and one diplomat dryly noted that the king sampled many courses, in every sense of the phrase. Yet, despite his eccentricities, Ferdinand remained respected, loved for his stability, feared for his basement. He died peacefully in his bed, leaving behind a prosperous kingdom, an unnerving legacy, and a firm reminder that some rulers collect allies, and others collect corpses in display cases. The year was 1119. Jerusalem still trembled beneath the dust of the First Crusade. Christian pilgrims wandered toward the Holy City, certain it was finally safe. It wasn't. Outside the walls, chaos bloomed, bandits prowled, raiders struck caravans, travelers vanished into slavery. The dream of peace in the east was cracking. Then came a knight named Hugh de Payens, and 8 companions who made a vow not to a crown, but to God. They swore to protect pilgrims with their lives, soldiers in purpose, monks in spirit. They renounced gold, wives, and comfort. Just horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A title long enough to require patience, but fitting. King Baldwin II housed them on the Temple Mount, among the ruins of Solomon's Temple. From there came their name, the Knights Templar. For 9 years, they were an oddity, unofficial, penniless, and slightly terrifying. They trained obsessively, shared armor, and lived like beggars who prayed with blades in hand. Yet word of them spread. Their strange mix of piety and violence caught the attention of Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk so famous even popes returned his letters. He saw in them a holy purpose. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, he helped formalize their rule, a code of prayer, discipline, and battle. The Templars, once just desperate men with a dream, were now a papally sanctioned order. Donations flowed. Nobles abandoned silk for chain mail. From the dust of Jerusalem, an army of monks began to rise. Their white mantles soon bore crimson crosses, symbols of faith and fate. Their vow to the Pope made them untouchable by kings, which would one day be both blessing and curse. They became the vanguard of Christendom's fragile foothold in the Holy Land, fortified, relentless, and terrifyingly devout. Their rule was simple: never retreat unless outnumbered 3 to 1. No ransoms. No mercy. No fear. They believed death in battle was a holy ticket straight to paradise. When the Second Crusade faltered, the Templars did not. While noble lords bickered, they fought with precision, turning hopeless skirmishes into brutal triumphs. Muslim commanders began noting them by name in reports, the men in white with red crosses who did not break. They were not knights who plundered. They were knights who persisted. Across the Levant, they built a chain of stone fortresses, Safed, Tortosa, Bagras, militarized sanctuaries with hidden wells and walls thick enough to mock catapults. When others fled, the Templars stayed. They were loyal only to the cross, answering to no king, only their Grand Master and, above him, the Pope. It made them unique. Dangerous. Their secrecy bred fascination. Their wealth bred envy. From a handful of beggar knights, they had become a brotherhood that spanned continents. And in time, their true battlefield would shift, from Jerusalem's deserts to the treasuries of Europe. They had started as guardians of pilgrims. Within a century, they would guard the money of kings. They never meant to become bankers. War made them wealthy. Faith made them trusted. Necessity made them clever. It began with gifts, land, gold, livestock, even entire villages from nobles eager to buy a little salvation. The Templars didn't hoard their blessings, they organized them. Across Europe they built commanderies, farms that ran like quiet machines, every grain and goat counted. Money moved with astonishing speed. A monk in London could send silver to Jerusalem in weeks. Then came their true innovation, paper. A pilgrim could deposit coin in Paris, receive a coded letter, and withdraw the same amount in Acre. Early banking, cloaked in holiness. They charged fair fees, kept perfect records, and never defaulted. In an age of chaos, that made them indispensable. Kings, queens, bishops, all trusted the Templars. They guarded royal treasures, managed papal accounts, ransomed prisoners, and funded crusades. At one point, they even lent to the same monarchs who would later destroy them. Yet they never flaunted their wealth. Their chapels were plain, their robes simple, their words humble. Beneath that austerity, though, was an empire of ledgers, vaults, and iron-wheeled wagons moving coin across continents. They swore it was all for God, but gold tends to attract attention, especially from men who owed too much of it. Their purpose had shifted. No longer knights of pilgrimage, they had become something stranger, soldier monks who owned no kingdom yet financed them all. Their faith still burned, but their battles faded, and with peace came whispers. Power without oversight makes kings nervous. Meanwhile, the Holy Land, what they had fought to defend, was slipping away. Saladin rose in the east, uniting Egypt and Syria under a single, patient will. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he fulfilled his vow. Jerusalem fell. The Templars fought to the last but were crushed beneath the sun. Captured knights were shown no mercy. Saladin executed nearly all. To him, their devotion was too dangerous to spare. The loss of Jerusalem broke more than armies, it broke purpose. Still, the Templars endured. The Third Crusade brought Richard the Lionheart, who admired their courage but could not reclaim the city. Over the next century, the Crusader states withered, Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. The last Templar fortress in the Holy Land was gone. They retreated to Cyprus, rebuilding halls that echoed with ghosts. They were still warriors, but with no holy war left to fight. Their castles became relics. Their rules, once sacred, began to soften. Rival orders rose. Rumors spread of pride, greed, strange rituals. They were too rich, too secretive, too independent. The East had forged them, but without it, they drifted, monks with money, soldiers without war. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Knights Templar remained wealthy and feared, but irrelevant. The Crusades were over. Their purpose dissolved, leaving only power. And power without a reason is dangerous to keep. Watching closely was King Philip IV of France. Philip the Fair, though fairness was not his virtue. Bankrupt from war and drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templars, he saw an opportunity. They were his creditors, his rivals, and worst of all, beyond his control. They answered only to the Pope, paid no taxes, and held fortresses on French soil. To Philip, that wasn't piety. It was provocation. To Philip, the Templars were a problem disguised as piety. Too wealthy, too independent, too untouchable. A kingdom within his kingdom. So he began to plot. His scribes spread quiet poison in the air, rumors of secret idols, blasphemous rites, and obscene initiations. No evidence, just whispers. But in a superstitious age, whispers were weapons. Philip leaned on his compliant Pope, Clement V, to open an inquiry. Clement hesitated. Philip did not. He set a date, sealed orders in silence, and prepared a purge that would echo for centuries. Before dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, an unlucky day ever since, soldiers moved through France. Doors splintered. Knights were dragged from their beds. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was taken in Paris, betrayed by the same crown he had once served. Across the realm, commanderies were raided, vaults emptied, and the charges read aloud: heresy, idolatry, sodomy, devil worship. None of it was true, but truth had never stood in the way of power. Torture did the rest. Men screamed until they confessed to impossible sins, spitting on crosses, kissing one another in dark ceremonies, worshipping a severed head called Baphomet. Even de Molay, broken and bleeding, confessed, then later took it back. Justice, it seemed, was a stage play lit by fire. Philip had done what swords could not, destroyed his creditors through accusation. The Pope, humiliated and trapped, tried to contain the storm but could only follow its course. Some kingdoms hesitated, England, Spain, even the Holy Roman Empire delayed the trials. But in France, the machinery of ruin rolled on. Templar property was seized, their treasures redistributed, though much of it vanished. Some said it was hidden away, others that the true treasure was knowledge, secrets, relics, perhaps even the Grail itself. Whatever the truth, the order was finished in spirit long before the Church made it official. By 1312, the inevitable became ceremony. Under relentless pressure from Philip, Clement dissolved the Knights Templar at the Council of Vienne. The papal decree, Vox in Excelso, stripped them of title, land, and name. Their properties were granted to the Hospitallers, at least, the ones that hadn't already disappeared into royal pockets. Officially, it was mercy. In reality, it was erasure dressed as righteousness. The once great order evaporated, leaving behind only rumors and ruins. But history rarely ends politely. 2 years later, in 1314, Jacques de Molay was brought from his cell after 7 years of silence. Alongside Giaffre de Charny, he faced the pyre. Both had retracted their forced confessions, declaring the order innocent. For that they burned. As the flames rose on the Isle de la Cite, de Molay's voice carried through the smoke, calling on God to judge the guilty. According to legend, he cursed both Pope Clement and King Philip, saying they would meet him before the year's end. Clement died within a month. Philip followed before the year was out, struck down suddenly. Coincidence, perhaps? Or justice, finally awake? Whatever one believes, the curse endured. The Templars were gone, but their shadow remained, an echo of devotion twisted by power, still haunting every Friday the 13th since. With that, the last true voice of the Knights Templar was silenced, not in battle, but in betrayal, torture, and fire. Their story ended in the smoke, yet their legend was only just beginning to breathe. The flames that consumed their bodies dimmed, but the embers of their myth refused to die. Their castles were seized, their leaders executed, their name erased. And still, somehow, the silence made them louder. Instead of fading, the Templars transformed, from condemned monks into eternal symbols of secrecy and power. The same veil that once shielded them now fueled rumors. What became of their treasure, their relics, their sacred knowledge? Some swore they had spirited away the Holy Grail, others whispered about the Ark of the Covenant, or a bloodline too holy to name. There was no proof, only suggestion, and in the medieval world, suggestion was enough. Stories soon claimed the Templars had survived underground. Some joined other orders, some turned mercenary, and others, so legend said, went silent, preserving their rites and relics in secret halls, waiting for history to forget. Centuries blurred, and their shadows stretched. They were accused, or credited, with everything: cathedral building, Freemasonry, hidden empires. Conspiracies sprouted endlessly. That they ruled banks. That they guided revolutions. That they never died, merely changed robes. The Templars became fiction's favorite shapeshifters, appearing as saints or villains, conspirators or guardians. Dan Brown gave them sacred bloodlines. Assassin's Creed turned them into the architects of civilization's unseen order. Each tale twisted the truth but deepened the fascination. The real Templars were human, brave, devout, flawed men trying to balance faith and violence. Myths, however, are more forgiving. They offer meaning where history offers dust. And so, centuries later, the Templars still ride, armored, eternal, their legend untouchable. Philip the Fair burned their bodies, but he could not extinguish their story. More than 700 years have passed since the last Grand Master died on the banks of the Seine, yet the Red Cross lingers, in books, in carvings, in the corners of conspiracy. They were more than warriors. They were inventors. In a world ruled by divine right, they created a network of finance that stretched from London to Jerusalem. Their letters of credit foreshadowed modern banking. Their commanderies worked like early corporations. Theirs was globalization before the word existed, built not on stock, but on vows and steel. Militarily, they redefined what it meant to be a knight. Before them, chivalry was personal, inconsistent. The Templars made it law, discipline, creed. They fought not for glory, but for an ideal, and when they died, it was often quietly, but never without consequence. Culturally, they blurred the line between holiness and war. They proved faith could be a weapon, wielded in prayer or in propaganda. And their fall became a warning: even the righteous, when powerful enough, invite their own undoing. The Templars began as servants of God and ended as prisoners of kings. But their shadow still falls across every story that asks where power truly lives. Their downfall revealed something uncomfortable: the fragility of even the most sacred institutions. Divine authority, it seemed, was only as strong as the politics behind it. The destruction of the Templars was less a crusade than a medieval corporate purge, carried out not by shareholders, but by kings and popes. Today, their image is more myth than man, but myths have a way of outliving truth. The Templars' memory, brave, devout, betrayed, reminds us that history isn't always written in triumph. Sometimes it's written in ash. So when you see a red cross on white cloth, remember, it once marked men who believed they served God, until ambition and fear rewrote the divine plan. In the fire and gold of that betrayal, their legend was forged. By the 12th century, the world was shifting. Trade routes widened, learning blossomed, and the church was stretching its influence like an empire reborn. It was an age of building, not just in stone, but in spirit. And in the heart of Paris, one dream began to rise. Its architect was Maurice de Sully, Bishop of Paris, appointed in 1160. A man of faith, yes, but also of vision. The old cathedral, Saint Etienne, was crumbling. Paris had outgrown it. The city needed a heart worthy of its ambition. So Sully dreamed higher, a cathedral so vast, so radiant, it would eclipse everything before it. Not a fortress of faith, but a beacon of glory. This would not be Romanesque, heavy, dim, enclosed, but something lighter, daring, Gothic. In 1163, the first stone was laid, tradition says by Pope Alexander III himself. The work began at the eastern end, the choir and apse, where voices would one day echo beneath vaults of glass and stone. But this was no ordinary project. Notre Dame was a promise carved in limestone, a commitment stretching across generations. Stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths gathered, quarrying stone, chiseling detail by hand, scaffolding skyward. Every rib, every window, every gargoyle was a prayer made solid. The first builders knew they would never see it finished. Sons inherited chisels from fathers. Time passed, and still Notre Dame climbed higher, slowly, gloriously, above a city of mud and timber. For Bishop de Sully, it was never just a church, it was worship made tangible, a declaration that humanity could build its way toward heaven. As the 1170s unfolded, the cathedral began to rise not just as architecture, but as symbol. In a city of cluttered roofs and smoky alleys, it became a monument of air and light, a sermon written in stone. The new Gothic language transformed faith into geometry. The walls grew thinner, the ceilings soared. Pointed arches pulled weight downward, freeing space upward. Ribbed vaults didn't just hold the roof, they lifted the gaze, and perhaps the soul. And then, there was the light. Unlike the shadowed Romanesque churches before it, Notre Dame was made to glow. Stained glass bloomed in every wall, flooding the nave with color, a vision of heaven refracted through stone. When dawn touched the stones, Scripture itself seemed to awaken. The church was no longer just telling stories, it was illuminating them. Every piece of Notre Dame carried meaning. The pillars weren't mere supports, they stood for saints. The arches weren't decoration, they were metaphors for salvation. The stone was theology, and the masons were its silent scribes. Beyond its rising walls, Paris was changing. The cathedral became the city's heartbeat. Markets gathered at its feet, sermons drifted across the Seine, and students from the new University of Paris studied in its shadow. Notre Dame was no longer simply a building, it was the soul of a growing city. Yet progress moved at a patient pace. No cranes. No machines. Only wooden scaffolds, muscle, and faith. Hundreds of workers labored year after year. When one died, another took his place. Their names were forgotten. Their devotion was not. They built not for fame, but for God, and for those not yet born. By 1200, the choir and much of the nave stood complete, the outlines of a miracle taking form. Notre Dame had crossed from dream into stone, from vision into endurance. But as it rose toward the heavens, ambition rose with it. The builders soon met a problem: gravity. The higher the vaults climbed, the more their weight pushed the walls outward, threatening collapse. The old Romanesque answer was to thicken the walls and shrink the windows. But Notre Dame was meant to breathe, to glow, to reach heaven through light. So the masons dared something new, something almost untested. the flying buttress. These were not mere supports but external wings of stone, arching from the upper walls down to freestanding piers. They caught the cathedral as it leaned and guided its weight safely into the earth. From a distance they looked fragile, like lace frozen in air. In truth, they were triumphs of design, turning stone into flight. With the pressure lifted, the builders carved open vast windows, rose-shaped wheels of stained glass that filled the interior with a kaleidoscope of saints, angels, and prophecy. Ironically, the earliest blueprints for Notre Dame had no such wings. The builders invented them midstream, improvising under strain and turning necessity into grace. Some critics found the new supports ungainly, but most stood transfixed. The cathedral looked as if it were being lifted by invisible angels. It became not just a monument of faith, but a collaboration between belief and mathematics. A hymn carved in gravity-defying limestone. By the early 13th century, Notre Dame had already transformed Paris, yet its most iconic face was still emerging. As the eastern choir neared completion, the focus turned westward, to what would become its identity: the twin towers and the grand facade. This was no mere entrance. It was a sermon in stone. The doors soared skyward, and above them, a gallery of kings, prophets, and demons gazed down in silent judgment. To enter was to step beneath eternity. Construction on the towers began in the 1220s, rising slowly, block by block, over decades. They reached nearly 70 meters high, majestic but unfinished. No spires crowned them, no needles pierced the clouds. Just two solemn giants, flat-topped, timeless, and unshakably proud. Between the towers stood the Gallery of Kings, 28 figures symbolizing the monarchs of Judah, later mistaken during the French Revolution for French rulers and tragically beheaded by furious mobs. Yet in the 13th century, their message was unmistakable: divine authority, heavenly order, sacred rule. The church and the monarchy moved as one, and this was their grand entryway. Beneath them, three vast portals unfolded theology in stone. The central one, the portal of the Last Judgment, depicted Christ enthroned in glory, surrounded by angels, demons, and resurrected souls emerging from their tombs. To the uneducated crowds, these carvings weren't mere adornments. They were scripture. The message was simple: enter with awe, for eternity begins here. Above the doors, a rose window bloomed, nearly 10 meters wide, framed by delicate tracery and watched over by statues of the Virgin and Child. Sunlight filtered through its colored glass like a sacred lantern, scattering the images of saints across the nave. By the mid-1200s, the towers were nearly finished. The facade stood complete, solemn, balanced, and commanding. It was a citadel of belief, a proclamation of divine rule, and a warning to sinners. But the builder's work wasn't done. Notre Dame's heart still awaited completion: the transept, the roof, the spire that would one day touch the clouds. They had crafted its face, now they would grant it a crown. With the towers and western front rising proudly against gravity, the cathedral was no longer a shell. It needed a soul, found within its nave, transepts, and choir, spaces destined to echo with monks' chants, kings' footsteps, and the prayers of countless believers. By the mid-13th century, focus turned to the transepts, the arms of the cruciform plan that defined Gothic architecture. Under architect Jean de Chelles, and later Pierre de Montreuil, these wings were extended and graced with new rose windows, even grander than those in the west. The northern window glowed in cool blues and celestial violets. The southern burned with golden and crimson light. These hues weren't random. They were faith rendered in color. The north symbolized the Old Testament, the south the New. Together, they told salvation's full story, one illuminated by light, the other by flame. Inside, columns soared like forest trunks, supporting vaulted ceilings nearly 35 meters high, their ribs converging like hands folded in prayer. This wasn't just architecture, it was movement, a silent ascent drawing the spirit heavenward. At the center stood the altar, the sacred core where Mass was held, relics honored, and France's nobility knelt. Royal weddings, coronations, papal visits, Notre Dame became the nation's spiritual stage. Yet it wasn't reserved for the powerful. Commoners came too: merchants, peasants, pilgrims, filling the air with songs, sermons, and whispered pleas for miracles. Every surface spoke, sculptures, stained glass, even the floors told stories. Notre Dame didn't merely contain faith, it embodied it. Belief lived here, carved in stone, drifting in incense, glowing through glass. By the late 1200s, its heart was nearly complete. The cathedral pulsed with life. But it still awaited one final gift, a spire that would reach for heaven itself. By the close of the 13th century, Notre Dame already appeared miraculous. Its towers reached skyward, its nave resonated with sacred chants, and its rose windows filled the interior with radiant, colored light. Yet something felt incomplete. The cathedral had a face, a heart, and wings, but no crown, no upward gesture drawing the gaze from roof to heaven. That was when plans for the spire took form. Unlike the twin towers, massive and earthbound, the spire would be slender and graceful, an arrow of faith rising from the transepts crossing at the core of the cruciform design. Built from oak and covered in lead, the first spire was both an engineering feat and a spiritual symbol. It was more than adornment. It was Notre Dame's exclamation mark, its most visible prayer. The project demanded exceptional craftsmanship. Carpenters and metalsmiths labored with ropes, winches, and scaffolds to lift heavy beams into place. The structure had to be light yet strong, able to resist the fierce winds sweeping from the Seine. When complete, the spire pierced the Parisian sky like a blade raised in devotion. Beneath it, intricate details continued to emerge. Gargoyles, eerie, fantastical figures, took shape in stone. They weren't merely grotesque decorations. Many served as rain spouts protecting the walls from erosion, while others stood as guardians, reminders of sin and the presence of evil. Alongside them, chimera statues, part beast, part imagination, perched above the city, their stony eyes forever watching. They embodied the Gothic fascination with mystery and symbolism. Inside, the chapels were finished, choir stalls carved, and holy relics placed with reverence. Notre Dame was now fully alive, both a sacred engine of worship and a national monument. It had taken nearly 2 centuries of effort, countless hands, and the unwavering faith of an entire kingdom. By 1345, construction was deemed complete. Yet complete was never the right word. Notre Dame was never static. It would be renewed, reimagined, and revived through the ages. But by the 14th century, the physical masterpiece stood finished. The Gothic era had reached its zenith. By the mid-1300s, Notre Dame de Paris was no longer just a cathedral. It was the cathedral, a towering emblem of Catholic power, royal prestige, and national identity. For the next 400 years, it remained the beating heart of France, hosting the great spectacles of the nation's history. Coronations, royal weddings, and solemn funerals unfolded beneath its vaulted ceiling. When monarchs wed, they did so in its glow. When wars began or victories were declared, its bells thundered across the Seine. Kings entered as rulers of earth and departed as anointed by heaven. Yet its doors opened to more than royalty. Generals, bishops, and foreign envoys all came to kneel, to pray, or to bargain. During famine, plague, or invasion, Parisians filled the nave with pleas for mercy. The cathedral became both refuge and witness, a sanctuary of hope and dread. Politically, Notre Dame served as the spiritual anchor of the French monarchy. Its location on the Isle de la Cite, the heart of Paris in both map and meaning, made it the perfect stage for royal ritual. Priests blessed banners before battle, and the monarchy's power was sanctified by divine association. If the king ruled the nation, Notre Dame ruled his soul. Culturally, it remained a wonder. Pilgrims journeyed from afar to venerate its relics, including the crown of thorns said to have touched Christ's brow. Its great organ roared during feast days. Its choirs filled the air with polyphonic melodies that expanded medieval sound. Notre Dame evolved with time, embracing new art, music, and worship forms. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, Gothic grandeur had fallen from fashion. Baroque design was the new ideal, and Notre Dame, dark, soaring, and medieval, was dismissed as old-fashioned. Several attempts were made to update its appearance, softening what had once been bold. Yet it remained, a cathedral trapped between eras, honored but increasingly ignored. Its towers endured storms and centuries. Its bells still rang, but something was quietly shifting beneath the stone. Notre Dame had been born of faith and crowned by monarchs. But soon it would confront a force even stone could not resist. Revolution. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Notre Dame de Paris found itself on the wrong side of history. For generations, it had stood as a monument to monarchy and religion, two pillars the Revolution sought to destroy. Suddenly, the cathedral that had once crowned kings became a symbol of tyranny, and in revolutions, symbols rarely survive intact. The assault was both ideological and physical. Revolutionaries stormed the church. The statues of biblical kings decorating its facade were mistaken for French rulers. Each of the 28 was decapitated. Sculptures were shattered. Altars defiled. The great bells that had once celebrated royal births and papal visits were torn down and melted for artillery. Sacred relics, including the crown of thorns, were removed and hidden. Many vanished altogether. What remained was an empty shell. Notre Dame was formally deconsecrated in 1793. It was no longer a church, it became the so-called Temple of Reason, a stage for revolutionary ceremonies praising secular enlightenment. At one point, the Sacred Hall even became a wine warehouse. The grand nave that once echoed with hymns now reeked of damp wood and spilled barrels. The spire, cracked and unsafe, was dismantled. Gargoyles tumbled from their ledges. The roof leaked. Rats scurried through the crypt. Paris seemed to have lost its heart, its soul reduced to a forgotten ruin at the city's center. And still, it endured. When Napoleon seized power, he understood the cathedral's symbolic weight. In 1804, he chose it for his self-coronation as emperor. Notre Dame was hastily cleaned and reconsecrated for the ceremony. Yet this was not an act of faith, it was spectacle. Napoleon famously took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it upon his own head. Once again, the cathedral served power, though stripped of its sanctity. But decades of neglect had taken their toll. By the 1830s, Notre Dame was collapsing both physically and spiritually. Demolition was seriously considered. Some Parisians believed the city would be better off with something modern, something brighter, less medieval, less melancholic. And then, a writer intervened. A man who saw beyond the broken stone and weathered saints to something immortal, something sacred. Just as the world was ready to abandon Notre Dame, Victor Hugo revived it. In 1831, his novel Notre Dame de Paris, known later in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was published. It was more than a Gothic tale. It was a fervent cry for preservation, a love letter that saved a cathedral from oblivion. Through the eyes of Quasimodo, the disfigured bell ringer, Victor Hugo transformed Notre Dame into more than a setting. It became alive, a character wounded yet magnificent in its ruin, and readers were moved. The novel stirred emotions across France, awakening Parisians to what they stood to lose. The cathedral wasn't merely ancient, it was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of devotion and artistry. The public outcry worked. In 1844, King Louis-Philippe approved a massive restoration project. Leading the effort were architects Eugene Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Their goal was not just repair, but revival, to restore the cathedral's soul. They replaced eroded sculptures, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and envisioned a new spire to replace the one destroyed during the Revolution. Viollet-le-Duc's spire would rise 96 meters above Paris, taller and more ornate than its predecessor, soon becoming one of Europe's most iconic silhouettes. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, Notre Dame reclaimed its place as the spiritual and cultural heart of Paris. It hosted masses, witnessed liberation celebrations, and welcomed millions of pilgrims and travelers. It endured 2 world wars. During Nazi occupation, its bells fell silent. When Paris was freed in 1944, they rang in victory. But tragedy struck again. On April 15, 2019, a fire ignited beneath the roof. Within minutes, flames devoured the ancient wooden lattice known as the forest. Some beams dating to the 13th century. The inferno raged for hours. The roof collapsed. The 19th century spire fell in smoke and flame. The world watched in shock as one of humanity's greatest monuments seemed to vanish before their eyes. And yet again, it survived. The twin towers stood firm. The rose windows endured. Sacred relics were saved. The people of France, and the world, vowed to rebuild. Notre Dame has always been more than stone. It is memory, identity, endurance. A church, a symbol, a survivor. In every new stone lifted from the ashes, it reminds us that faith and beauty can rise again. She was born in 1775 in China's Guangdong province. Her birth name is lost to history. The world would come to know her as Jingyi Sa, the wife of the pirate Lord Jingyi, but what she did with that name would shake empires. In her youth, she worked aboard a Cantonese floating brothel, a harsh reality for poor coastal women of the 18th century. These flower boats entertained merchants, naval men, and pirates. But she was different. She listened, observed, remembered names, and made powerful clients talk. Over time, she became not just entertainment, but an information broker. Then came Jingyi, a pirate commander who ruled the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most formidable forces in the South China Sea. He wasn't the first pirate she met, but he would be the last. Captivated by her intelligence, Jingyi offered marriage. She accepted, but on her own terms. In a bold move rare for her era, she negotiated power. She demanded joint control of the fleet, not merely as wife, but as partner. She would oversee alliances, manage plunder, and share in all strategic decisions. Jingyi agreed. Whether out of affection or foresight, he knew she was invaluable. Their marriage in 1801 marked the birth of one of the most successful pirate dynasties in history. Jingyi Sa quickly immersed herself in the politics of piracy. She studied its hierarchies, rivalries, and unwritten laws. While Jingyi fought at sea, she built networks, won allies, and learned to rule from the shadows. But her time in the background did not last. When Jingyi died suddenly in 1807, possibly in a typhoon, many expected his empire to crumble. Rival captains waited to divide his spoils. Instead, Jingyi Sa seized control, not by brute force, but by calculation. She assumed command of the Red Flag Fleet, secured alliances, and married Jingyi's adopted son and lieutenant, Chengput Sai, consolidating loyalty and power. Within a decade, she had risen from brothel girl to pirate queen. When she took command, she didn't inherit chaos, she forged an empire. Under her leadership, the Red Flag Fleet expanded rapidly. The South China Sea had long known pirates, but none like her. Jingyi Sa commanded over 300 ships, a number that swelled beyond 600 within a year. Some accounts claim her forces reached 1,800 vessels and 70,000 men, more than the navies of several European nations combined. She ruled through discipline and sharp political instinct, binding her captains not by fear alone but through a codified system that rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. Her pirate code governed every aspect of life: loot, hierarchy, conduct, and consequence. Disobedience met swift justice, theft from the common treasury meant execution, assaulting a female captive meant death. Deserters had their ears cut off and were paraded before the fleet as warning. But it wasn't just fear that held them together. Jingyi Sa offered protection, order, and profit. Her laws ensured pirates kept a fair portion of their loot, 20%, while the remainder went into a communal treasury she personally oversaw. This system gave everyone a reason to stay loyal, creating unity through structure. Even defeated rivals and coastal dwellers often chose to join her rather than fight. She organized her vast armada into 6 divisions, each marked by a color: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green, though all ultimately answered to her. Her most trusted ally, Chengput Sai, commanded the Red Squadron, her elite unit. Under Jingyi Sa, piracy evolved into a functioning government, complete with taxes, defense, and hierarchy. She ruled the waters from Vietnam to Hong Kong, directing trade, plundering imperial garrisons, and collecting tribute from coastal settlements. The Qing dynasty had a navy, Jingyi Sa had an empire, and it was expanding fast. She didn't rule by charm alone, she ruled by law, strict and unbending. While pirates are often imagined as unruly drunkards, her fleet ran more like a disciplined corporation than a mob. At the core of it all stood her pirate code, a precise and unforgiving set of regulations that turned chaos into order. This code wasn't a romantic legend scribbled under candlelight. It was harsh, binding, and enforced without mercy. Every captain and sailor knew the risk. Minor disobedience meant disgrace. Major offenses meant death. One notorious rule governed how plunder was divided. After every raid, all goods were delivered to a central storehouse. The raider who captured them kept 20%. The remainder filled the common fund. That fund, managed by Jung Saw and her lieutenants, supported ship repairs, widows, bribes, and emergencies. Theft from it wasn't just forbidden, it meant execution. Discipline defined her rule. Disobedience during combat brought severe punishment. Anyone who fled, ignored orders, or abandoned comrades could be whipped, executed, or thrown overboard. Desertion? Instant beheading. Even personal conduct was controlled. Pirates who captured women were required to treat them respectfully. Assault meant immediate execution. Jung Saw didn't seek anarchy, she demanded control, and her code guaranteed it. It built a system where every sailor knew the rules, their share, and their fate. Loyalty was owed not only to Jung Saw herself, but to the order she embodied. Astonishingly, she welcomed prisoners and villagers into her ranks, provided they swore allegiance to her code. Many accepted, some out of fear, others out of respect. Others simply recognized that under Jung Saw, piracy was safer, richer, and oddly fairer than life under corrupt Qing officials. Her governance extended beyond her ships. Settlements under her protection paid tribute for peace and self-rule. Those who resisted were burned, those who submitted became part of her growing realm. She wasn't merely a pirate, she was a ruler. And her word was LAW.BY 1808. Jung Saw's pirate dominion had grown into more than a maritime menace. It was a national power, commanding the South China Sea, disrupting trade, and striking imperial ports with unstoppable precision. The Qing dynasty, humiliated and desperate, was forced to act, but it wasn't ready for what awaited. The Imperial Navy launched a campaign to destroy Jung Saw's fleet, sending warships to hunt her across the South China Sea. What followed wasn't a string of victories but a public disaster for the empire. Again and again, imperial squadrons were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outsmarted by Jung Saw's forces. She knew the coastline like no admiral ever could, using storms, islands, and shifting tides to trap larger Qing vessels. Her crews fought in perfect coordination, switched ships mid-battle, and led enemies into ambushes with surgical precision. Entire Qing fleets were sometimes seized, their ships absorbed into her red flag fleet. The contrast was striking: imperial officers, often corrupt and timid, versus her disciplined and loyal sailors, bound by code and rewarded by success. As defeats mounted, the Qing dynasty's panic became clear. They turned to European powers, Portugal and Britain, for naval help. The foreign fleets had superior cannons and sturdier ships, yet lacked the unity and local mastery of Jung Saw's armada. Still, pressure built. By 1809, a coalition of Qing, Portuguese, and Cantonese forces surrounded parts of her navy. Even then, she fought them off, retreating only to strike back with shocking precision. She wasn't merely surviving, she was embarrassing an empire. But the war drained her men and supplies. Even empires built on plunder can't fight forever. Though undefeated, Jung Saw realized the truth many rulers never do. True power isn't always about winning every battle. Sometimes it's knowing when to end the war on your own terms. She had no desire to die at sea or be paraded in chains. Instead, she prepared her boldest move yet. By 1810, Jung Saw had done the impossible, resisted the Qing dynasty, humbled foreign navies, and commanded the seas without rival. Yet she was pragmatic. Endless war bred only exhaustion. Her supplies were dwindling, alliances fraying, and morale thinning. So she changed strategy. She approached the Qing court not as a defeated pirate, but as an equal. Her message was simple: negotiate. She offered peace, but on her terms. The Qing had failed to crush her. Their citizens feared her more than they obeyed the throne. She had leverage, and she used it. Sailing into Guangzhou under her own flag, flanked by armed escorts, she demanded amnesty for herself and every pirate under her command, thousands in all. She insisted on keeping her wealth and requested that her husband and second-in-command, Chung Pasai, receive an official rank in the Qing Navy. To the government's surprise, she got nearly everything she asked for. The exhausted empire, unable to afford another campaign, agreed. And so, on April 18, 1810, Yungi Sa surrendered, not in defeat, but in triumph. 17,000 pirates marched into the city in orderly procession, laying down arms without bloodshed. 200 ships were turned over, the Confederation dissolved. No executions. No confiscations. No humiliation. Chung Pasai became a naval officer. Yungi Sa retired, wealthy, respected, and undefeated. In a world where pirate legends end in betrayal or execution, Yungi Sa's story closed with negotiation and freedom. She had conquered first with cannons, then with diplomacy. After the surrender, she and her husband settled in Canton, today's Guangzhou. The transformation from pirate queen to dignified citizen seemed impossible, yet for her, it was simply strategy. She lived openly and comfortably, largely ignored by the Qing authorities. Soon, she reinvented herself again, as a businesswoman. She opened a gambling house and oversaw an opium trade, ventures technically illegal but tolerated due to her influence. And no longer chasing empires, she chose stability, without surrendering control. Her wealth remained intact. Her reputation endured. Her marriage with Chung Pasai lasted, and together they raised a family. While he served the Qing Navy, ironically hunting pirates much like they once were, she managed their growing enterprises and advised merchants and sailors along the coast. Her story defied every expectation. Born poor, sold into prostitution, she rose to command one of the greatest fleets in history, and unlike any of her peers, she retired peacefully. When she died in 1844 at the age of 69, Yungi Sa had long since transcended her legend. She wasn't just a survivor, she was the architect of her own destiny, a woman who rewrote the ending every pirate feared. She never sought redemption, she didn't need it. Her life itself was an act of rebellion, a living challenge to every rule, expectation, and boundary drawn around her. In an age when women were barely permitted a voice, Yungi Sa commanded fleets, drafted treaties, and bargained with emperors. Then, she walked away wealthier and freer than any pirate before her. Her cannons fell silent, her sails folded, yet her legends still rippled across the sea. History remembers figures like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan, men who ruled the Caribbean, spread terror, and met brutal ends. But standing beyond their shadows is Yungi Sa, not as an equal, but as their superior in nearly every sense. She didn't lead a few ships, she ruled hundreds. She didn't sack a few towns, she controlled whole seas. And she didn't die in a noose or gunfire, she brokered peace and retired on her own terms. Among pirate legends, she remains the most successful and least understood. Her dominance came not from luck or cruelty, but from strategy, intelligence, and her deep grasp of power. She was a strategist, a negotiator, and a master psychologist. She bound loyalty through fear, yes, but also through discipline, reward, and a sense of order. What makes her story extraordinary is that she accomplished all this as a woman in Qing-era China, a society defined by Confucian ideals that silenced and confined women. Women weren't expected to lead armies, much less navies. Yungi Sa didn't just defy that rule, she obliterated it. She earned the respect of hardened captains, forced an empire to bargain, and ended her life as a business leader and matriarch. She didn't depend on a man's legacy, she inherited it, expanded it, and ruled it as her in popular memory. She lingers like a ghost, less glorified than her male counterparts, less romanticized by Western storytellers, and often erased from mainstream history. But along Asia's coasts, her name still carries all. The Red Flag Fleet may be gone, But Jung Yi-saw's memory endures, drifting across the South China Sea like a phantom vessel, silent, untouchable, larger than life. Not just a pirate. Not just a woman. A legend who made empires kneel. In a world governed by men, she didn't ask for a seat at the table, she seized the entire ocean. Despite commanding the largest pirate confederation ever recorded, Jung Yi-saw remains curiously absent from many history books. Her legacy, immense yet obscured, was buried beneath layers of colonial bias, gender prejudice, and political unease. Why? Because her story refused to fit the template. She wasn't tragic like Blackbeard, didn't die in a blaze of glory, and wasn't European. Worst of all for the record keepers, she was a woman who defeated an empire. That truth disrupts the comfortable, male-dominated narrative historians have long preferred. In Qing records, she's treated as a problem solved, not a life worth chronicling. The empire didn't want to honor her, it wanted to forget her. She exposed their naval weakness, defied their authority, and escaped without punishment. Even in victory, she was an imperial embarrassment. Western historians did little better. For centuries, piracy was framed through European myth, peg legs, rum, and buried treasure. Jung Yi-saw didn't fit the costume. She wasn't swashbuckling, she was calculating. She didn't duel for fame, she negotiated for dominance. She wasn't killed by the state, she outmaneuvered it. For some chroniclers, that wasn't romantic, it was inconvenient. Yet her legend is resurfacing. Modern historians, feminists, and maritime scholars are restoring her place in history. Documentaries, novels, and games now echo her name, the pirate queen of the South China Sea. Still, much about her remains cloaked in mystery. Her birth name is lost, her voice preserved only through hostile accounts, Qing scribes, foreign sailors, European merchants. But even those fragments outline a figure of immense power. She wasn't merely a woman who broke the mold, she was one who refused to acknowledge it. Jung Yi-saw never waited for permission to rule. She took power, wielded it with precision, and disappeared into history with more wealth and authority than any pirate before or after. She didn't fade, she was erased. Yet legends, inevitably, resurface. Jung Yi-saw wore no crown, she didn't need one. Her rule came not from divine right or noble blood, but from command, respect, and fear. Her realm was the South China Sea, stretching from Tonkin to Guangdong, a kingdom without borders, flags, or throne. Her confederation wasn't mere crime, it was governance. She managed trade routes, imposed laws, negotiated treaties, and maintained order across waters the Qing Empire itself struggled to control. Her ships weren't scattered raiders, they were fleets. Her captains weren't renegades, they were officers. Her people weren't drifters, they were citizens of a maritime nation. And her ending remains unmatched. While others perished by rope or cannon fire, Jung Yi-saw ended in peace, wealth, and victory. She stepped off her ship unbroken, undefeated, and still holding command. By the time she died in 1844, she had done what no pirate or emperor had before. She chose to leave power behind, intact. Today, few monuments bear her name, but her spirit lingers over the South China Sea, whispered by sailors, invoked by rebels, and admired by those who know that true leadership is forged not by birthright, but by will. Jung Yi-saw proved that greatness doesn't wait for permission. Even in a world built to silence women, one voice, sharp, strategic, and unyielding, can command an empire. She ruled without apology, fought without hesitation, and retired without defeat. Her sails may be gone, but her shadow still stretches across the waves.